This week, we will be looking at the basic, most important terms of peace studies that we have already looked at in the first week. And then we have looked at many ways in which they apply in the weeks since then. So we have already quite a bit of experience with using these terms. We'll be looking at them, however, again today uh, more in depth. So the point is here not to introduce new terms. There will be new terms and new concepts that will be introduced later as we continue in the course. But this time the purpose is really to look in depth at things we already discussed or looked at, and also not just in depth, but also in a critical way. Because as you can imagine, peace studies is not just made of one person or one group of people who present things in a certain way and everybody is in full agreement with it. Obviously not. Just like in every science, you have different perspective, you have different emphases, and the specialists disagree with each other sometimes, or at least they are trying to offer so-called constructive criticism. And of course, peace scholars you would expect are peaceful. Uh, Galtung used the term peace by peaceful means, which means don't fight to tell people that they should not fight. But in reality, of course, sometimes some of that does happen. And some of the suggestions on how we should work for peace can be criticized as being, well, a little bit too much uh, like fighting to get people to stop fighting. So anyway, we will be looking at these things. So that's the purpose of a second look, even if maybe we have looked at it already quite a bit, but not in that way. So first of all, concerning all the terms, not just the very few key terms that we have been looking at so far and that we'll consider this time, but many other terms connected to peace. We have two glossaries. There are probably more out there, but two glossaries that I've been already using, and they are in the resources module. So you should these two glossaries are available, and you should use them whenever you want to know the real meaning of a term that you hear and that sounds familiar but not very clear or even totally unfamiliar. The one on the left has been prepared by the University for Peace in Costa Rica, the UN University. In my opinion, it's the better one and it's more complete. The one on the right has been prepared by the United States Institute for Peace in Washington, D.C. It's also very useful. It's good to compare the two, but it doesn't have as much as the one on the left. So anyway, I recommend them to you whenever you feel like checking in a dictionary, basically. Now, very briefly, going back to what is peace? Obviously, it's more than just the absence of war that we have discussed. Um, I let you read, pause and read. Um, we cannot have no conflict, but we have to handle conflict in a certain way. Now, going to the second point, peace in English is derived from a Latin word, pax. And that's the word that's generally considered in the Western world when you hear peace or paix in French or similar words. They always imply or generally imply that it's a contractual relationship that implies mutual recognition and agreement. So peace, when you see a peaceful landscape, you don't mean that. Peace at home, maybe, but especially in politics or human society. A state of peace means a state where people recognize each other's rights mutually and they agree on that recognition. You know, I acknowledge your rights, you acknowledge mine, we are good. That's a state of peace because we are not fighting for each other's recognition. So that's a very basic, almost legal term. Actually, it includes a legal meaning of peace as opposed to open warfare. But there is generally across the world, and especially in many other cultures, a sense that there is something deeper to peace. It's not just that contractual or mutual agreement or that mutual recognition on a very basic level, even if I don't like you. There is generally across the world in different civilizations a sense that there's something deeper about being at peace than just a contractual agreement of, non-aggression. And it generally implies something to the extent that there is also an inner dimension to peace. I'm not just not fighting you, but I have a peaceful and I have attitude and I have goodwill towards others. It's in my heart. That is yet generally implied in many civilizations, many cultures, when they speak about peace and using the words that each culture has for peace. Even in English, he's a peaceful individual. It's like a peaceful landscape. There is something that makes you feel peaceful and harmonious in you. Now, if you look at the different terms, and I have just a few here, peace, that comes from the Latin pax, we just saw that, and pace, pace. These words in the different Romance languages, or they have the same. It has the same meaning. In East Asia, you have essentially a composite word of peace and harmony that you have in Korean, Japanese, and Chinese, in one order or the other. So the normal word in Korea for peace is Pyeonghwa, which means peace and harmony. But recently, we have heard in our movement in Korea, I've heard speeches to the extent that there is another, you can turn it around and it becomes Hwapyeong with some kind of a deeper meaning. Anyway, I just wanted to bring that up. I will not speak at length about languages. Now, if you take the Japanese word, it starts with, it's heiwa. That means Pyeonghwa. It's just a different pronunciation based on the same Chinese character. The Chinese, however, they turn it around. So like Hwapyeong, if it was Korean, and it's something like Hey Ping. I'm not good at that. So you have in these three languages, you have a kind of a variation in terms of the position, but always the implication that there's peace and harmony. Needless to say, each one individually of these characters can have vastly different meanings, like peace can also mean flatness and all kinds of other things. So we could, speak about this indefinitely. And then in the Middle East, you have the very famous shalom, and in Arab, that's Hebrew, and in Arabic, salam, salam alaikum as a greeting. There also, the implication of the words is not just peace, it's translated as peace, peace be with you, and like that, but it implies a lot of other things. And generally, you can say that these words imply many of the qualities that we generally see in peace. If you're at peace, you're calm, you're compassionate, you are loving, you are this and that. So all these are included in these words. So that's about the richness of the word peace. Now, continuing on our journey through peace, back to negative and positive peace that we have already looked at, and they seem very simple. Just a reminder, Galtung popularized these words, these terms in 1964, but already 10 years earlier, Quincy Wright and Fred Cottrell, completely forgotten names today, are the ones who created these words, who initiated the use of these terms. So they were not invented by Galtung. Negative peace, there's really very little to say about it. It just means no fighting at this moment. So we all agree on that. Positive peace is, of course, more complex because it means something in addition. And that something is everything that's included in expressions like conflict transformation. I mean, the conflict is not just put on ice temporarily, but transformed into the sense of, positive feelings towards each other, based specifically on social justice that makes these positive feelings possible because the parties don't feel that they're being harmed or that they're being mistreated. So they can feel peaceful towards each other. And making war or creating conflict is unnecessary in that case. And it involves constructive steps towards human well-being. That's again another word, well-being. How can you be at peace, or how can you behave peacefully when you don't feel well? And that doesn't mean just because you're sick, but you feel that somehow you cannot be the way you would like to be. Then it's easy to blame somebody else. So positive peace implies circumstances where everybody has at least a chance to feel well, to have well-being. That means no structural and cultural violence. Now, you already heard from what I said today, that is the well-being, peaceful, the attitude type aspect, and then there's the structural type aspect. No social injustice or structural violence. So it is interesting to see that with the pioneer of peace studies, Johann Galtung, I forgot to put his name, but that's his writing in 1969, he has changed over time. And actually, over time means from the very beginning in 1964 to just 5 years later in 1969, he already said that he had changed. He says, I'll read it. Whereas negative peace is fairly constant, so it's simple meaning, nothing to discuss. Positive peace, the meaning of positive peace is constantly changing or evolving. And he compares that to positive peace in positive health in the medical sciences. It's interesting. Positive health is honestly a term that I never heard, but it's easy to understand what it means. Negative health being, I'm not sick today. The doctor asks you, how do you feel? I'm not sick. I don't have anything, except that I'm severely overweight. I have this and that, too much cholesterol, all the lifestyle things. Right now, I'm still young. I don't feel anything, but you don't have positive health. You have a very unhealthy lifestyle that harms you invisibly. It's still under the water, underground. You don't see it, but you have so to have positive health, you need to exercise, you need not to eat too much. You understand what I mean. That's positive health. But with time, science develops, medical science develops, and what doctors in general recommend evolves. What is today considered to be a healthy amount of cholesterol in your bloodstream, maybe 10 years from now will be considered too much, or not enough, or plenty, or fine. These things change over time as we discover our bodies and the needs for a healthy lifestyle better. So the same thing, according to Galton, happens with the notion of positive peace. Overall, we understand what it means. It means conditions that make fighting unlikely. You don't just stop now, but you have also circumstances, conditions that make the expectation for lasting peace credible. But what that exactly represents has been changing. And he said he himself used to see positive peace in terms of integration and cooperation, people working well and smoothly together. But he says now he agrees with Hermann Schmidt, somebody else, that this expresses a much too integrated and symmetric view of conflict groups and probably too much emphasis on the East-West conflict. What does that mean? It means that people between the West and the East, I mean, the Far East or East Asia, tend to a very different way of looking at things. That's perfectly correct. Any of you who has, and that means many of us, been confronted with that, we know. Westerners do things differently from Asians. They also do things, Americans do things differently from Africa. But culturally, there's really a huge gap between Asia and the West. The way we greet, the way we do all kinds of things. So this can lead to conflict. And Galtung says here that integrating the ways with them is understanding and unifying the ways we do things. So at least, yeah, understanding what this type of behavior means for you and what it means for me. It's not the same thing, entering without taking off your shoes in the West is normal. In East Asia, it's a site of disrespect. So that's one part of creating positive peace. But Galtung said that's too much one-sided, fixation on this East-West thing. But now I would identify positive peace mainly with social justice. So that is an evolution in his perspective. And we will see that this focus that Galtung has on social justice can also be challenged. So I just wanted to show that he has himself changed over time. And since 69 and until his death, he has stuck to the notion that the main thing to create peace is social justice. If you have social justice, the conditions for peace will be there. But he admits that there can also be different types because positive peace is very a vast concept, and he acknowledges that others can see it differently. Now, here the first critique or criticism of the terms positive and negative peace, and you will be able to look at this very interesting paper written by a scholar called, a rather young scholar, a US scholar called Toren Hansen, Tori, for those who know him. Negative and positive are unfortunate expressions, says he. And this because they suggest good or bad. Negative peace is bad peace, or at least inferior peace. Whereas in reality, it's not necessarily true. So that's a fact. Negative, when you hear negative something, you think, oh, it's bad. Now, I don't think we can change that because positive and negative peace is generally used by everybody, but it's a good point to make. And it's not just Toren Hansen. Many other scholars feel that these are problematic expressions. I think, well, be aware that they can be problematic and be aware that positive and negative doesn't mean good or bad. Now, his particular point is for those people who live in circumstances like the ones you have on this picture, negative peace may be the most important and groundbreaking move that they are waiting for day and night more than positive peace. Now, think of Gaza or Ukraine. In Gaza, when you are being bombed like this, or actually, whichever side you are on and whatever you believe, one thing is sure, when you are being bombed, you are not dreaming of positive peace. You are dreaming of one thing, let this stop, even for 10 minutes, So negative peace, that means, okay, truce. Let's stop for a while. That's what people are longing for. And then once that is there, then they think of how can we make this last? And you see in the negotiations that there's a constant back and forth between those who say, there's no perspective for real peace now. So at least let's have a truce, even for a few weeks. And those, for instance, in Ukraine, who say it's useless because if we stop for a few weeks, we'll start again. We have to take the time to come together to a real agreement. And then the other says, yes, but if you do that, it will take forever. And everybody will be dead by the time we come to agree. So let's stop at least for now. So it's a constant back and forth between the value of negative peace and the value of positive peace. Do we wait to have everything, or do we go for what's immediately available and necessary? So you will have that back and forth constantly, and you can see it in the news. That was peace. Now we go on considering the concept of violence. So that's just a repetition. There's direct structural and cultural violence according to the grand old man of peace studies, and it's generally used very much. Galtung himself, has proposed a diagram, which I think is very good because it shows a little bit what's behind these terms. Direct violence is the violence that you see. I shoot at you, you see that, that's violence. Structural and cultural violence, you don't see them. That's actually a criticism. How can you call that violence when actually nobody's doing anything to you visibly? Well, this is an iceberg. And we all know from school that icebergs, I think 90% or something like that, by far the largest part is invisible under the ground. But when a ship hits an iceberg, that part under the ground is usually the part that does the biggest damage. So that is a very good image, I think, a very good illustration. So cultural and structural violence, they are underground. You don't see them, but that doesn't make them any less dangerous or important. They're actually, if anything, even more important than the direct violence, which is supported as like in the iceberg and just supported by the other types of violence and just the one that is most visible. Now, there's no problem with direct violence. Everybody agrees. It's all the things that kill or injure people in one way or another, murder, rape, assault, etc. Basically, nothing, we can move on, right? Structural violence is already much more tricky. The form of violence consists of harm produced by unjust social structures. By their very existence, such structures prevent large groups of people from securing their basic needs and developing their full human potential. So if you don't have enough to eat, you cannot be expected to be peaceful. You can fully be expected to do anything you can, even using violence, to get something to eat from those who have it. So don't allow this to happen. People whose full human potential is not fulfilled will always be frustrated because eating and being at peace is one thing, but if you're maintained in a situation where you cannot, for instance, study, you cannot develop your creativity, and you live like subhuman beings, you cannot be peaceful either. Frustration will accumulate. Now, one challenge with that is what is our full human potential? Certain things like what I just said, creativity, education, they're obvious. But beyond that, what is the full meaning of a full human potential? That is something that we will discuss in the course on unification approaches to pieces. On that one, we have something to offer that goes beyond what people usually understand by full human potential, and also it clarifies some ambiguities. Often, structural violence is not perpetrated consciously by any particular individual or group of individuals. So that's why often it's criticized. How can you speak of violence when nobody does it? But of course, it's an accumulate structures, unjust structures exist because of an accumulation of negative activities or actions by people in the past. And they solidify and they become hard structures that cannot be changed easily. But somewhere there has been, or there still is, some kind of a hostility, some kind of a negative or evil, you could say, attitudes by people in power who make these structures possible. So in that sense, you can say, even though nobody consciously decides that you are miserable, but you are. And so it's legitimate to speak of structural violence. To defend that choice of terminology, I always try to think of the term violate. When you have somebody living in a slum, absolutely miserable, that's not direct violence because, well, the person maybe has lived in slum and his ancestors too for a long time, and maybe police raids the slum sometimes. I mean, usually they would, but the fact of being in a slum is not that somebody puts you there. It's just a result of a social structure, a social reality that makes that some people are rich and some people live in slums. So there's no actual violence involved in the fact of you being miserable. But you can say that these living conditions violate your human rights. The word violate is much wider than just violent. It means something that violates your rights as a human beings. If you think of that term, of the verb rather than violence, it's much wider and it gives some kind of a justification to the notion of structural violence, structures that violate your human rights. Now let's go to cultural violence. I've already explained cultural violence is just simply the perspective of certain people, privileged people, who consider that violence that's done to people who are inferior is not that bad because it's kind of normal. And you have here like rich people at the bottom right, living well, and then they're slaves working hard because these slaves are primitive people. On top of that, they are inferior from an inferior race in the mind of the others. So things that you wouldn't do to your own, that would be unacceptable violence. You cannot ask your son to work like a slave. That would be unacceptable. But ask an African slave to do it, that's fine because they are made for that. They are inferior people, somewhere between animal and human, so whatever, then it's perfectly fine. So as long as you put a stamp on somebody that the person is inferior, it's perfectly okay to mistreat that person. It makes me think of religious persecution, which, we see it today in front of our eyes. As long as you put the stamp on somebody or a group of persons as being inferior, evil, crazy, a cult, suddenly doing things to them that are completely unacceptable if you do them to somebody normal, become completely acceptable. That's also a form of cultural violence, right? You first start a campaign to make the person or the group look like absolutely evil. You destroy their character, assassinate their character, make them look terrible in the media, for instance, or in society at large. And once that's done, any kind of injustice perpetrated against them will seem at least benign. Okay, this may be a little bit questionable. Some people will see like the way they do, but anyway, they deserve it. So that's the notion of cultural violence, generally applied to people who seem to be inferior and therefore violence against them is acceptable. And that has been traditionally the justification for the slave trade. Now, here I have a current example. Now, it's already 16 years old. I can't believe it because in my mind, here in the United States, probably you haven't heard of it. Here in the US, it's something that's in people's minds still. this gentleman, Henry Louis Gates, is actually quite famous. He has a TV show called Finding Your Roots, where he interviews and discusses with famous people, including like famous movie stars and other famous people. Uh, he interviews them and discusses with them and behind the scene researches their ancestry, including using DNA and things like that, and shows them things about their past, I mean, their ancestors that they never knew. So he done that with Michael Douglas, with Scarlett Johansson, and people like that who discovered that, oh, I thought my ancestors were Danish. No, they were Swedish. Or I never knew that I had black ancestors, even though I'm from a white family from the South and we had slaves, but actually some, that kind of thing. So he became very famous to that. Plus, he is a Harvard scholar, a professor at Harvard, living just right next to the school, Harvard School. One day, he came back from a trip and his key didn't work or something, so he had to force his way into the door. A neighbor saw that some black guy is trying to enter that door. He's probably breaking in. Called the police. The police came and asked this gentleman to show he said, that's my home. And he said, well, show me your ID. And he said, well, that's my home. I don't have to show my ID. I'm at home. And then the police arrested him and brought him to the police station. So it became a big scandal. And he said, why did you do that to me? Why did you arrest me in front of my home? Because I'm black. So you automatically assume that I was breaking in because black people break in your mind, of course, in your mind. And so he accused them basically of racism. The police, they were white. No, we are not racist. We have heard a complaint that you are trying to break in, and we are trying to verify that you are indeed the owner of this house. In that case, we would have let you go, but you refused to show it. So you can see Obama, who was president at that time, made some comments that were not necessarily helpful. Finally, he invited both the police and this professor to the White House, and everything was fine. So you can see it various ways. You can say, yeah, that was really a typical case of cultural violence because they felt, well, this guy is black, so we have every right to treat him like a potential criminal. You can see it also as, well, he could have been a little bit more flexible, could have understood that police didn't know and just show them his license. I would have probably done that. But anyway, that is a typical example. That was a big thing in the United States. Now, what is the criticism that has been leveled against expressions like cultural and especially social violence, structural violence, sorry, structural and also cultural violence. When applied to social structure or cultural norms that are largely anonymous, there's not one person did this or that, the term violence is questionable. It personalizes these structures and norms as if they were intentionally meant to be a form of aggression. Now, in the case of the police who interfered with black professor's day, it was one person, so there was direct, but he wasn't violent. He just asked him to show his papers and then his documents and then arrested him. But he was just, the concept of structural violence means, well, he may have been the tool of the system, but the real violence was by the system that considers it to be okay to do what he did. Torren Hansen says, well, I wouldn't use the word violence because, again, it's anonymous, and he would he suggests harm. This is cultural harm or structural harm. Now, I think good luck, Torren Hansen, because these terms are now so famous that I don't think it will change. But he has a point. Harm would be perhaps a better choice of words. You know, you can harm somebody without intentionally doing so. You can have prejudice that you're not aware of and be harmful in your behavior towards somebody, and you don't hit him, so you're not violent, you just harm him. It's maybe fine. Uh, another problem, nevertheless, that I see with the term structural violence, that's me, not Hansen, is if you suggest that there is violence, structural violence, then you also suggest somehow that it may be needed for you to counter this structural violence by your own violence. In other words, if there's structural harm, you try to change it, to reform it. When you involve the word violence, structural violence, that immediately suggests that another form of violence has to be applied. So it may be not very useful to create, peace by peaceful means. You have this concept, the structural violence, it immediately suggests in you that maybe you need to fight with violence too. So that's just a psychological aspect that I felt needed to be noted. Actually, Galton himself said sometimes I don't want to overwork the word violence, then I just say social injustice. Fine, but the two go together. We have been speaking about violence a lot and also about structures. The structures, that's the existing structures that are there, that are beyond anybody's capacity to influence immediately. The opposite of the notion of structure is the notion of human agency, and that's also important. That's the ability of anybody to act and affect change, even though structures keep you prisoner in a way, but you still have a certain ability to affect change. So, especially in relationship to social change, the role of human agency is essential. Individuals can directly influence their environment and act as agents of social and political change. So the concept of human agency involves issues related to intention, causation, and responsibility, and is commonly linked to norms and values. So that's the aspect in the work for peace that I would say as unificationists we consider to be essential. We would say in the subject position, what can people do? Something needs to be done to change things. Human initiative, taking responsibility, even sacrifice if necessary. So that is part of the vocabulary of peace studies, but it's a little bit in the background compared to the issue of social structures and the need to change the structures. So in contrast, structuralists view external conditions, institutions, economic forces, linguistics, culture as the precipitators and causes of social and political change. That means the great man theory of history, which is that great people appear like Jesus or Genghis Khan, if they can be militaries, and they really change history. That is an illusion. What really changes history is not human agency, it's determined by social structures. So are leaders shaped by the constituencies and movements that they lead, or is it the other way around? Structuralism is actually a philosophical theory that was a fad in the 1960s and 70s, particularly in France, that emphasizes essentially the role of structures and the fact that people are actually helpless in changing structures, And human agency, be it by great people like Jesus or even by you and me, is an illusion. You cannot change things. The social structures that are unjust will not change. Then if you see it that way, then the conclusion would be, forget it. We'll never have peace because we'll never have a change in social structures. Actually, people who think that way don't believe that. They believe that once social structures are in place, they become very, very um, stable. They have an inertia, like when you have a big stone and you push it, if it's very big and heavy, it will resist. You need an extraordinarily strong push to make it move even by 1 inch. And for instance, the caste systems, very difficult to change, as those of you who live in such a country that has them know. Even though they may become illegal as they are today in, let's say, India, but they're still there. It's very difficult once a structure in place to make it change. Inertia makes them resistant to change. They are the product of human agency, but once they are there, human agency can no longer change them. And it's true. We make sometimes, it's like you can with some kind of tractor, or so you can push soil forward, move it until you have a big heap. And at some point, all the soil that you moved has become such a huge heap that you cannot move it anymore. You moved it, you created it, but it became so big that you cannot move it anymore. So that's the vision of social structures. And if they're unjust, then they are very problematic and something should be done. And that's where a little problem can happen. PCS, peace and conflict studies, generally they don't address too much the fundamental questions of human freedom and determinism. They look at it in a rather neutral way. We have to have peace and we have to change things, but they don't go too much into, because it's a question of consensus. Um, yeah, peace studies do not go also too deeply into that issue in general. But nevertheless, we have, because also they are not philosophy. Nevertheless, if the perspective that is practiced by peace and conflict studies, even unconsciously, is wrong, then the results of trying to make peace will also not be very good. That if the perspective is flawed, then the result will be that actually the problems, the underlying problems, will not be solved, but rather they will be strengthened, they'll be worsened. And we can see sometimes that, as I suggested before, peace activism can become combative or even bellicose. Bellicose means like warlike. That does happen. And sometimes even Galtung, when he speaks, you can feel that underlying uh, perception, that underlying mood, or that underlying uh, attitude that almost it's necessary to fight to obtain justice. And I guess many of us feel that way too sometimes, but it can be problematic. So um, you have leading figures of peace and conflict studies who emphasize the qualities, the human qualities that are needed for human agency to change things. And these are compassion, humility, courage, righteousness, appreciation of differences, don't be biased, one-sided, solidarity, somebody is treated unjustly, stand by his side, spirituality, be loving, and also feel, if you believe in God, that you should act in such a way that God can be with you. Inner peace, kindness. Elise Goulding, for instance, emphasizes all these attitudes very much. But then again, the other side will say, yeah, that's all fine. It's nice to be nice, but you're never going to change structures that are unjust by being nice. Then you are stuck. You can change the structures by being nice. So do you expect the structures to change by themselves? Obviously not. You say you cannot change them, but how much more, how much less will they change on their own? So we just accept things. Well, there's one response which is kind of almost logical. It's Lenin. Lenin expressed it best. It's the notion of the revolutionary vanguard. Essentially, it means you and I, we live in situations that are unjust. We are either on one side, who live the good life and at the expense of the people who suffer, or we suffer under the people who lead the good life and everything in between. Trying to change things with goodwill and niceness is useless. The structure is too strong. So what you need is people who are enlightened, and that means intellectuals, who are enlightened and understand how this works. And they have to lead everybody else to make this change. And that change can be done only through violent revolution. So that is, I'm not saying that peace studies is Marxist, but I'm saying we have to always look out for that underlying thought system. It's there. And obviously, the problem with that is that the people, the revolutionary vanguard, they change things not through any of these qualities. So anyway, they are going to change things and make things what? Worse. And they are going to be, and that has been the history of Soviet communism. You take it upon yourself to be the ones who know, and you change things with violence that cannot be changed by human agency, and then you expect things to become worse. It's problematic, and I just wanted to highlight that risk. So finally, Torren Hansen gives what I think is the best perspective on these things. Positive peace consists of direct actions of kindness, fostering the well-being of the body and mind, and spirit for oneself, inner peace and others. That's the equivalent of the contrast to direct violence, how to handle that. Then structural actions to cultivate societal freedom, equity, dialogue, integration, solidarity, and participation, and cultural actions that legitimize both positive and negative peace rather than violence. That's just a plan for action, doesn't solve anything fundamentally. So I hope that today I did not get you completely confused, but that you could see how each one of these concepts leads to other invisible things. It's a little bit like the iceberg. The terms structural violence and this kind of terms, they also have, besides what we immediately see what they mean, they have a hidden meaning that is also very much there. Not just the reality, but also the meaning of the term, and that moves people's minds. So I wanted you to be aware of that, and you can keep that in your mind for the rest of the course and hopefully for the rest of your career as peace scholars and peace activists. Thank you.